Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative, and United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gistina. With us this week is Yancey Roy. He's the Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. He knows all things New York State government and politics because he covers it in the Capitol, and we're always delighted to talk to him. And I asked him to come this week because it's the end of session. Quite an end of session at that. Welcome back to the Capital Connection, Yancey Roy.
Great to be here, Dave.
Yancey, obviously, the big story at the end of session was this sort of last-minute turnaround by New York Governor Hochul on the issue of congestion pricing, and it got quite the pushback. But, of course, some of this, as some of the analysts have pointed out, may have to do with it being an election year and people in New York not wanting to pay $15 to go into New York City.
Yeah, I think that's, all in all, it's the most likely reason. I mean, Governor Kathy Hochul cited, opposition to it. It's not popular. Said that the working class New Yorkers who drive in or businesses who deliver, goods and services through the city can't afford it. And those aren't the rich guys that would be paying this. And so it would be a bigger hit than folks expected. But I think all in all, I mean, if you take out that it's, if it weren't a congressional election year, a presidential election year, you'd have to ask, well, would they have put it off at this time? Because this had been in the planning for a long time, and it was enacted by the state legislature 5 years ago. It took a lot of planning, some coordination with the federal government on various aspects, and then it was ready to go on June 30th. And just weeks before, Kathy Hochul had been touting congestion pricing, which we should say is basically a higher toll for driving into the busiest parts of Manhattan during the busiest parts of the day, up to $15. So it's a big hit on a toll if you're driving into the Manhattan.
And Yancey, the governor, was even in Rome with the Pope talking about the environment shortly before she reversed course.
Right. It had multiple benefits according to the backers. One is less cars, meaning less pollution in New York, but also less gridlock, more use of mass transit. And let's not forget congestion pricing expected to generate billions over the years to help fund the mass transit system downstate, whether it's to buy new subway cars, repair stations, or whatever. It was supposed to be a recovering sense of revenue so that the transit system and the folks who run it could do a lot of capital planning to fix things.
Yeah, yet the other fixes to that, for example, bailing out the transportation agency through a proposal to increase the payroll mobility tax or to siphon money from the state's general fund, that certainly didn't go through in negotiations.
Yeah, part because it was so late. The payroll tax would have hit just New York City businesses. The proposal was floated that way because raising the payroll tax in the suburbs would definitely cost people their legislative seats because it has in the past. But, Governor Hochul basically gave, 48 hours for folks to consider this. And, whether it was a combination of people angry because they didn't want to end congestion pricing or angry because they didn't want to do the payroll tax, or angry because, hey, this is just 48 hours to figure out a huge issue. Governor Hochul's proposal just went nowhere. One of the other things that got floated, by the way, was, she could tap into the reserves. I mean, Hochul has built up the rainy day fund. It's up around $20 billion, which is nice and healthy, way better than it used to be. And folks would say, well, what are reserves for other than just sitting in the bank? They're supposed to be when we're needed. Why don't you take out some reserves at least for 1 year to keep the MTA capital program going, and then we'll address things next year. But all of it's on hold now.
Yeah, and I want to because I left something out when it came to the congestion pricing plan, we're now probably going to see some lawsuits, right? I mean, Senator Liz Kruger, Democrat from the east side of Manhattan, she was almost apoplectic about this. She was angry at the governor, and she was encouraging others to sue.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how that might play out. Her point was that the legislature enacted this. It was a state statute that brought in congestion pricing, and that you can't just declare it stopped by a governor or whomever. I don't know all the ins and outs of the legalities here, but, generally speaking, the legislature will pass a statute and then some agency will be in charge of rolling it out and setting a start date. So unless there's a start date in the statute that, the actual start date for congestion pricing or anything else is not necessarily set in stone. So I don't know how that will play out, whether if they would have legal grounds to sue now or if, a delayed start doesn't necessarily mean that anybody broke the law. But, again, it's a threat that's out there. And like you said, she was basically encouraging. Also, we should note that late Friday night, and I mean like late, 10, 11 o'clock or so, the MTA leaders put out a statement basically doing two things. One, in so many words, they said that the pause on congestion and pricing is in effect. In other words, the board doesn't have to take a vote to pause it. It's paused. And at the same time, that MTA is saying we might now have to reevaluate, since we don't have authority to sign contracts or do any kind of long-term deal, do we have to put big projects on hold? We've got a whole list of things that we're supposed to do: station renovations, buy some new cars, some new diesel locomotives. We have to figure out which one of those we need to put on pause ourselves.
Yeah, and at least when it comes to the Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, he claims that this last-minute kerfuffle over congestion pricing eliminated some of the other negotiations on some of the environmental legislation, for example. So you've got the Repackaging and Reduction Act, and you've got the New York Heat Act, both which many lawmakers were keen on and thought would be able to make it through the negotiations, did not.
Yeah, and, two things there. I mean, he's definitely right that they had to sidetrack and have what's in the halls of Albany called conferences. Basically, this is closed-door meetings of the majority party, which in New York is the Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate. They had to have long, lengthy conferences about what to do about the MTA or not do. And that does take up time. And besides these high-profile bills, there's lots of, very important little bills, hundreds of them that they have to get through in the last week. Things like renewing a county's authorization for red light cameras, or, passing legislation that's needed to convert a parkland into some other use that a local town might want. There's a lot of bills to get through. Now, so he's right in that it takes up time. But the flip side of that is, the legislature can leave whenever it wants to. The legislators could stay an extra day, extra 2 days, or whatever. At some point, you have to make a call about whether you want to continue the talks or whether it's just not worth it at this point and go ahead and adjourn.
Well, we've talked about a bit of what hasn't passed. Let's talk about something that has passed, which, as we just got done talking about the environmental legislation, there's a third piece that did pass. This is pretty important, too. Climate Superfund Act, which requires polluters to pay. 5 years ago, says the New York Times, lawmakers passed the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which committed the state to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2050. As of now, New York does not appear to be on track to meet that goal. But at the very least, the polluters will now have to pay.
Yeah, they passed what's called the Superfund Act. It's one of the few environmental things that did get through. I mean, there were some other things that got knocked off. The Heat Act and the plastics packaging bill, which again was another one of those, like we mentioned to earlier, the Senate passed it, but the Assembly did not get to it. So all in all, a little bit of a rough ending for the environmental community.
And while we're at it, we might as well bring this up because you've referenced it. And that is what we've been seeing since the Democrats have control of both houses of the legislature and the governorship, that in many cases, it seems like legislation passes in the Senate, but flounders or lags or doesn't get addressed or fails to pass in the Assembly. And that makes me wonder, because it used to be that the Senate was in Republican control, and that's the place where a lot of Democratic initiatives went to die. Why, when Democrats, I know it's a big party with progressives on one side and more conservative or moderate Democrats on the other, why is it happening that Carl Hastie in the Assembly is the place where a lot of progressive legislation goes to die?
Well, there's a couple of dynamics there. One is there is a simple fact of math, and the Assembly is 150 total members compared to 63 senators, so 2.5 times bigger in the Assembly. That means everyone's got local bills. It takes longer to set out an agenda. It takes longer to discuss an agenda. There's more than 100 Democrats, so when they have a meeting, about, say, congestion pricing. If 100 people want to speak, 100 people get to speak. So there is a little bit of practicality there, and why the assembly always takes longer. But then also, and constitutionally, if you will, in terms of their viewpoint on issues, I think a couple of things. The assembly is definitely, on the one hand, probably more progressive or liberal on criminal justice legislation. If the Senate passes something that might toughen penalties or give prosecutors leverage, the assembly is the chamber where they want to put the brakes on that. But then at the same time, when you have issues like the Packaging Act, I think the Senate just finds it a lot easier to pass those, and it's harder for the Assembly to get its collective decision around those. But we should also mention that the companies were lobbying hard against those. And
right, and the speaker, Yancey, was using a lot of the language that the companies were feeding in their advertisements to kill the legislation.
Talks of like trying to scale down some things, bring down some target goals or dates or what have you, and could they meet in the middle somewhere? At some point, sometimes folks say, well, why don't the legislature just stay and stay and stay? Well, having been here long enough that you realize at some point, whoever the leader is, whether it's Carl Hastie or any of his predecessors, at some point, the leaders, they have to decide, all right, we're leaving on whatever it is, Friday or Saturday morning, because if you stay an extra week, it will basically never end. You'll keep negotiating issues forever. And calling a deadline does force people's hand to, all right, what's your final best offer on the table? And we can decide then.
We're speaking with Yancey Roy, the Albany bureau chief for Newsday and the Capital Connection. I'm David Gistina. Yancey, big push. This made lots of news in New York and even around the country because it has to do with social media, and that's the Safe for Kids Act. This is something Governor Hochul was really supportive of and kept pushing and talking about the mental health issues that many young people face and changing the algorithm and ways to eliminate some of this content from kids' social media feeds. And that passed.
Yeah, that was one of the strongest support in terms of votes. It had, I think, one no vote in the two houses combined. It was like altogether more than 200 yes votes and one no vote. And that one no vote was not so much on the principle of the issue, but on the carrying out of the law of who was going to monitor this issue, the state attorney general's office or the executive branch technology department. So, but basically, yes, it had a lot of support. And what you would have to do is social media platforms like Facebook or TikTok would be banned from offering what's called addictive algorithm-based feeds to young people without parental consent. The idea being that, and I don't think it's any secret here that, websites kind of curate feeds to send the, people who are on those websites to keep them there, keep them engaged, keep them always looking at the phone, keep them always online. And there's a lot of issues here, especially for young people, mental health issues. And, folks will say the more time spent on the phone, the less time you have for social, intellectual, or just friendly, sports and friendly play and get out there and get outside with other kids sorts of activities. And there was a big pushback from big tech groups about how do you carry this out? How do you verify who's actually on the phone going to these websites? But regardless, there was, like you say, a lot of support here, and it passed overwhelmingly.
Yeah, and the stories I've been seeing lately about when schools take away these cell phones and their social media access, learning drastically improves. And in fact, after a certain amount of time, kids seem to appreciate the fact that they're not addicted to that cell phone while they're in school. So who will monitor it, Yancey? Will it be the executive branch or the Attorney General's office? As
it falls right now, a lot of this is going to be under the Office of the Attorney General to execute here. And then one of the pushbacks, again, from web companies is how do you do age verification? Right. And, if it's actually going to help kids, how are you going to verify that the person holding the phone is the kid and not the parent or some other friend or whatever? So what's interesting also is that now that the bill's passed, you actually have to create rules and regulations for how you're going to carry this out. And the state has 180 days after Hochul signs the bill, which will be pretty quickly, to sort of carry out exactly how this is going to work. That's going to be crucial, especially on a piece of legislation like this. How do you actually verify? How do you monitor? Is this really going to have an impact, or is it going to end up being more of a feel-good bill that doesn't do what you want it to do? Some of that's going to be determined in how well they craft rules and regulations.
Talk about the devil in the details. Well, let's talk about casinos, Yancey. What's happened in this area? We've talked for a long time about casinos and whether we have too many now because they're all around us and in other states, and whether it's watering down the revenue.
Well, the state has authorization to award 3 more downstate casinos, and the companies are busy. They've been busy for years now trying to put together their proposals in order to win the bids. The timetable has gotten slowed down a bit. The State Gaming Commission was in charge of rolling this out, evaluating the bids, setting mileposts for when you have to put in your formal bid and other steps to be taken. Everybody who wants to bid, you have to get sign-off from what's called a community advisory council. Basically, that's a group of local leaders who say, yes, we want a casino here, or no, we don't want a casino here. Lots of steps there. And because of the complications, the gaming board it was expected really to start taking bids sometime early this year. Well, they put that completely off. There's some zoning issues, by the way, in New York City that are being worked out, which they wanted to see if those could be worked out before anybody puts in a bid, to make sure there were no hurdles there. And the Gaming Commission was saying we're looking at the end of 2025 before we'll award anything. So there was a bill that moved through the legislature with the support of longtime casino backers, which tinkered a little bit and put in some definite dates there. They didn't change the overall end date. We're still looking at the end of 2025 before anyone gets awarded a casino. But there are some important things within that. Most notably and most easily explained is the new legislation would order the Gaming Commission to accept bids and all the bids be formally in by August 31st. So there wasn't a hard date on when to submit bids, and now there would be if this bill is signed. And then the other important thing that it did, it's kind of inside baseball, but it's important. They moved up when you get your yes or no from your local community council. That will happen about 4 months or so after August 31st. There's a little bit of leeway there with some steps that need to be taken. But basically, you'd look at bids all in by August 31st, and then your local council signing off by, January or so, or maybe February. And then you'd have a field that would be pretty set because you'd have a bid in and you would know whether you have local backing. And then from there, the Gaming Commission could do the rest of the evaluation.
You are listening to the Capital Connection. I'm David Gustino. We're speaking with Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. Well, Yancey, something that's been moving through the state for a while. Other states have this, including Vermont, and it didn't make it through, but it's close, and I am betting they're going to continue to introduce this each session, and that's medical aid and dying.
Yes, that did not make it through this year. And you're right, they have been trying for years, and it's one of those issues, and you see this with other issues through the years at the state capitol. It comes in and you have a small bit of committed supporters, and gradually they have to work the hallways and the offices to encourage people to become backers of a piece of legislation. And that's certainly true of this issue. They did not get it through the legislature this year, but at the end, backers were saying they were feeling as close as ever. They think they built up a lot of momentum of support. It'll be interesting when it comes back next year because some of the major players in the legislature haven't necessarily sounded off one way or another. I think because the issue, like you mentioned, has been slowly building with gathering supporters. So it hadn't reached a critical mass yet. Next year we'll have to see if it reaches that point and then see where it goes.
Yeah, it was interesting because they've worked on this for over a decade, and we've done some stories on this. I even interviewed one of the major players here, but the idea that even one of the doctors' groups that was against the legislation actually flipped at the very end and decided to support it because the bill that they crafted has dealt with a lot of the questions that many have. How do you ensure that the person is not trying to commit suicide? And other questions like that when it comes to medical aid in dying. And so maybe, just maybe, next session we could see that legislation passed.
Sometimes what you have in Albany is some issues are sort of better primed for election years, and some are better primed for non-election years. For example, a minimum wage hike usually is pretty typically good for an election year. The state has done a number of those in the last few years. And you can almost see where, doing and we go back to the MTA, what we were talking before with mass transit, doing a payroll tax during an election year, probably a bad idea. And, as we're talking about the aid and dying bill here, that could be one where just strategically from how you might see the legislature see it, that might be one that has a better chance in an odd number year, that is, when the legislators are not up for election, than, say, an even number year. It just kind of works out that way because there are some practical sort of strategy questions for legislators when they tackle these issues.
So if you're looking at this session, you're looking at how the budget process went and the end of session, has the governor done a good job? Is she alienated any of her top Democrats because of congestion pricing? We've seen a number of articles about this.
It's interesting. If we go back to April, and I know everyone kind of moves on and goes to the next issue, but if you go back to April and you look at some of the stories from there, it was Kathy Hochul wins the budget fight, and she got lots of stuff that she wanted in that budget in terms of like what happened with school aid, what happened with taxes, and many top issues. It was Hochul got her way on most all of these.
Retail crime, theft.
Yeah, right.
The housing deal.
The housing deal, right. Everything was a check mark in her column. Now we come to the end of session, and it's a little bit of a different story. And you're right, it's kind of part of it is taken over by what's happened with congestion pricing. I mean, in one way, the governor got what she wanted, which is a pause on congestion pricing. But you're right. The next question is kind of fallout from that. If it's to help Democrats in congressional races this fall, or at minimum take a weapon away from Republicans, does it have that effect? Or is the internal strife among Democrats in Albany going to be just a little harder to deal with because of this 11th hour reversal? Did she alienate supporters? There certainly was a lot of anger among rank and file Democrats in the last few days, again, partially because this was so last minute. So they're going to be breaking from Albany. They might not be back for a while. Who knows? They could come back to do something for the MTA before January, but right now they're not scheduled to come back until January. So that might cool things off a bit if they don't come back for a while, and maybe some relations get mended a bit. But it's certainly, after such big wins in April, it's kind of a hard ending for Democrats here at the end. Just a lot of anger, not a lot of harmony at the end.
Well, I'm wondering, Yancey, with your observing the state political scene for so many years, whether the process, the budget wrangling process, the negotiative process has really changed in all those years. We used to talk about 3 men in a room. Certainly that's changed. You got 2 women and a man. But is it really the same? Is it really the leadership hammering out the final agreement? Yes, there's conference committees. Yes, they discuss the legislation with the members. But has the process really changed? Isn't a lot of this still done in secret?
Well, there's some that's changed that is important. I mean, if we go way, way back, budgets during the Pataki era when Sheldon Silver was leading the assembly, there was no time pressure whatsoever. And several times the budget supposed to be adopted on April 1, went all the way into August or middle of summer. And that was chiefly because Sheldon Silver saw no pressure to compromise, and his strategy was just hold out. That changed in 2010 when Governor David Patterson, basically threatened to use all the leverage that the governor has, where essentially, if the budget rolls past April 1, the governor can start imposing a lot of spending policies without the legislature, or force them to take them or shut down the government. So And Andrew Cuomo used that power. And I think ever since then, that's kind of changed the dynamic of, in terms of it used to be there's no deadline, who cares, we just need to get a budget, to I think people recognize it's all in their best interest to not dilly-dally till the end of summer with a budget. And at the same time, it's definitely also been more cordial between Governor Hochul and the leaders than it was with Andrew Cuomo and the leaders. But you're right in some sense that at the end, I mean, you're talking about 200 legislators, and to some extent, some of that has to funnel down through the leaders and their central staff. And, legislators get input on what the final budget might look like or the final legislative package might look like. But in the end, I think out of necessity somewhat, it has to be the governor, the head of the assembly, and the head of the Senate sitting down and figuring out what they can all find acceptable.
Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. Will former Governor Andrew Cuomo run for mayor of New York City? I'll leave you with that.
Well, that'll be the big political question coming up, won't it? Mayor Eric Adams will be up for re-election. He certainly had an up-and-down ride as mayor. There have already been other folks. Senator Zellner Myrie says he's exploring a run. So it'll be interesting to see how that race takes shape.
In the meantime, we are out of time. He is Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday, on this week's Capital Connection. Yancey, I'll always love talking to you. I'm glad we could spend this time. I know I'll have you back in the future, but until then, we appreciate everything you do.
Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure.
The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Guistina. Support for The Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.